Insulin at 100. Hughes is a good place to finish the introduction of a book celebrating a century of insulin. She was one of its most high-profile early recipients, and her story has become well known. But she also highlights its darker implications. Every human body requires insulin, but most make their own. For those who no longer do, injections are as vital as food, water, or oxygen. If treatment is stopped, symptoms return quickly, and death looms not far beyond. While it is often described as a chronic condition, T1DM in particular is better understood as a persistently treated acute one. Each injection only delays deterioration for a few more hours. There is no cure. Insulin only maintains life for as long as the people who need it can get it. In the 1920s, those who required insulin usually had to buy it. In those early years when supplies remained stretched, this could be costly. In Canada, in 1923, for example, it could cost up to $1 per day in a country where the average annual income was only around 500 Canadian dollars. Hughes' life was saved as much by her class context as it was by any pharmaceutical product. And while it is difficult not to be moved by her tale of triumph over adversity, it is important to remember that it occurred alongside countless tragedies. Many people continued to die needlessly of untreated, or insufficiently treated, diabetes after the introduction of insulin to medical practice. Unsurprisingly, most of Banting's private clients came from the upper echelons of North American society. Hughes was the daughter of a statesman. James Havens, who went on to become an accomplished artist, was the son of a congressman. Teddy Ryder must have felt in comparatively privileged company as the child of a humble engineer. Had she been born poor to an insignificant family, Hughes would almost certainly not have survived. When we take the time to celebrate the discovery of insulin, it is vitally important that we acknowledge the countless working-class Elizabeths who died and were forgotten, even as she received her first life-saving injections. This is particularly relevant today. In 2023, over a full century later, many continue to meet this fate for no other reason than simple economic misfortune. Insulin accessibility remains a major issue across the world despite well-established manufacturing operations that produce enough to meet the needs of all who require it. This is a particular issue in low and middle-income states, where poverty is rife, average wages are low, and healthcare infrastructures are both underdeveloped and underfunded, if they meaningfully exist at all. However, ideology as well as deprivation remains the source of much suffering. The United States is probably the most egregious example of this. Despite being the richest, most powerful, and most culturally influential country on the planet, its political leadership has consistently shown itself to be remarkably unwilling to enact legislation that would provide full access to medical care for all of its citizens. Most working-age Americans rely upon private insurance policies, often tied to employment, either their own or that of a family member. Private insurance is often very expensive, and even the more comprehensive schemes demand significant contributions from the individual in the form of deductibles and co-pays. Worse, those in poorly paid, and usually underappreciated, jobs often do not receive insurance at all. In these cases, they are responsible for purchasing their own coverage, and given the oppressive cost, some end up going without. The most vulnerable in American society are asked to pay the most, despite being the least capable of doing so. Many simply do not even attempt to access the care they need when they become sick or get injured, in the knowledge that doing so might land them in significant debt, even where they acknowledge that the decision puts their health at serious risk. It is difficult to convey how expensive health coverage can be in the United States to someone with little experience of it. One darkly humorous 2013 webcomic, for example, points out that the central premise of critically acclaimed TV show Breaking Bad, in which a mild-mannered chemistry teacher turns to producing and selling methamphetamine in order to pay for the expensive cancer treatment his insurance will not cover, would simply not make sense in countries with functional universal healthcare systems, highlighting how absurd it is that wrestling with medical bills has become a common trope in media produced in the richest country on earth. While it is an oversimplification, this is uncomfortably close to the mark. Uninsured, even an emergency ambulance call can run into the thousands of dollars, and treatment itself can cost many times that, particularly for more serious conditions. Today, insulin can cost upwards of $1,000 for a month's supply, and even those with insurance find themselves paying thousands each year to meet the requirements of their policies. It is that, or death. The history of insulin is, therefore, not the simple history of uncomplicated medical innovation making a once fatal disease survivable. Its first use in 1922 was only the beginning of a much longer story that forces us to engage seriously with questions about the way healthcare is, or too often is not, delivered globally, and the implications of leaving the provision of life-saving medication to profit-seeking companies within the broader context of free market capitalism. There is more to insulin's story, however. Beyond issues of economics and access, it invites us to reflect on ideas of power, authority, and subjectivity within medicine. In the early 20th century, doctors approached their insulin-using patients much as they did any other. As the professional, they often assumed an authoritative stance. They quickly discovered, however, that there was no way to enforce this. Day-to-day treatment occurs far from any doctor's office or hospital ward. The final decision on how much to inject and when lies with the user, not with their doctor. Insulin, as a result, transfers de facto power over healthcare to its recipient, whether or not they welcome it. This has important implications. Individual decisions about treatment in diabetes rarely have immediate life or death consequences. Instead, they impact blood sugar levels in ways that may or may not contribute to long-term risk factors. For example, for kidney disease or nerve damage, or run the risk of hypoglycemia. With full responsibility in the hands of the person undergoing treatment, insulin therapy, as a result, becomes a space in which subjective health beliefs and values are interrogated on a daily basis. Certain lifestyle choices, for example, might threaten overall blood sugar control without any immediate danger, but may potentially increase the long-term risk of complications, and the individual must consistently make value judgments on this basis, deciding how to proceed based on their own subjective needs and broader life context. Insulin drags healthcare out of the clinic. It forces us to engage with medicine beyond its professional borders. Someone using it is able to make active choices about which risks they consider worthwhile, regardless of their doctor's wishes. In doing so, they may put themselves at higher risk of long-term complications, but does this necessarily imply a failure of treatment? It demands that we ask these difficult questions. What precisely is health, and what makes treatment successful? How do we define expertise in the context of chronic health conditions? Who should have final authority in care, and what are the implications of a patient body able to unilaterally reject professional instruction? As of 2023, insulin has been used for over a century. This is reason enough to tell its story, but it is also directly relevant to our present time. Accessibility issues in North America often dominate the headlines, but the challenge is international. Rates of diabetes continue to rise globally, particularly in those middle-income countries that are rapidly industrializing and undergoing a demographic transformation, not unlike that experienced by the Western European states of the 18th and 19th centuries. According to the International Diabetes Federation, IDF, 537 million people currently live with diabetes of one kind or another, while the organization expects this figure to grow to 783 million by 2045. Insulin has never been more relevant. As the accessibility crisis rages on, increased political engagement has, for many, become an existential necessity. Activist communities highlight the tragic stories of those who have died for lack of health coverage and directly agitate for guaranteed access as part of a broader coalition demanding universal health coverage. The story of insulin is one that highlights the shortcomings of an inherently destructive economic system and emphasizes at every turn the need for a more redistributive global politics. Chapter 1. Toronto, 1921 to 1923. The story of insulin's discovery has become one of the most enduring in the history of medicine. It has been told many times over, most comprehensively by Michael Bliss in his classic work, The Discovery of Insulin, but a century later it remains just as gripping. With a rags-to-riches character arc, high drama, and a heroic conclusion, it feels almost as if it has been lifted directly from a Hollywood script. As ever, however, the simple narrative hides a far more interesting, if murky, tale, and one that invites us to ask serious questions about the way we understand the process of research and innovation in medicine. Frederick Banting, so it goes, made for an unlikely protagonist. Born into a relatively prosperous farming family in the countryside around Alliston, Ontario, he was not a particularly academic child and only barely managed to graduate from high school. In 1910, he began to study arts at the University of Toronto, but promptly dropped out after failing some of his first-year examinations. He then changed direction completely, sought readmittance, and started a medical degree in 1912. Banting was better at medicine than he had been at the arts, but he was never a particularly remarkable student. His final year was compressed into only a few months due to the heavy demand for medics on the battlefields of the First World War, and after his graduation in late 1916, he, like most of his cohort, went off to Europe to fight. He took well to army life, and even earned a military cross for bravery under fire, though not without being wounded by shrapnel. After some time spent recuperating in Britain, he returned to civilian life in Canada in 1919. After the war, Banting struggled to find work. Following a brief stint as a surgical resident at Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children, where, despite his best efforts, he was unable to secure a permanent position, he decided to try his hand at private practice. In the summer of 1920, he opened a modest office in London, Ontario. The fledgling business was, however, a complete failure. Increasingly indebted and professionally embarrassed, he took on a part-time job as a demonstrator at the University of Western Ontario, known colloquially simply as Western. Years later, in a 1929 lecture, Banting tried to put a positive spin on this period of his life. He was, he suggested, determined to become a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, and working at Western meant that he had easy access to the resources he needed to prepare for the necessary examinations. This was not an unreasonable goal for a man of his age and experience, but he also desperately needed the cash. Throughout the summer and autumn, he was making only around $50 per month, the equivalent of just over $600 Canadian today. When the costs of running his practice were taken into account, there was no hiding the fact that he was hemorrhaging money. Unsurprisingly, Banting was miserable. Decades later, he still found it impossible to forget the awfulness, the loneliness, and the financial worries of this period of his life, where painting and studying and teaching were apparently his only pleasures. By late 1920, he was exhausted and increasingly disillusioned with private practice. Few, himself probably least of all, could have predicted that he was on the verge of a dramatic change of fortune. Banting's Eureka moment. Towards the end of October, Banting was asked to deliver a talk on nutrition to a physiology class, specifically on the topic of carbohydrates and the way the body processes them. As a man much more interested in surgery, he seemed a strange choice. This was far from his specialist subject, and there is a good chance that some of his students were more up to date on the literature than he was. Nonetheless, he prepared the lecture as requested, finishing work late in the evening on the 31st of October. Apparently not a fan of light bedtime reading, he then decided to wind down for the night by browsing a copy of the latest volume of Surgery, Gynecology and Obstetrics. In it, he came across an article by Moses Barron, which, as chance would have it, was on the very same subject he was due to speak about. Barron's article described several post-mortem examinations. One of these, performed on a 40-year-old man who had died soon after being admitted unconscious to the Minneapolis City Hospital, seemed unusual. A large gallstone had been found completely obstructing the main pancreatic duct, the passageway through which digestive fluid leaves the organ. Most of the pancreas itself was withered and dead. On closer inspection, however, the doctors present noticed that one group of cells, the islets of Langerhans, seemed to remain functional. This case seemed to parallel the results of several prior experimental animal studies in which the pancreatic duct had been artificially tied closed, ligated. Whereas fully removing the organ, as Oskar Minkowski and Joseph von Mehring had, tended to quickly produce the symptoms of diabetes in animals, this procedure did not. The animals' pancreases did degenerate, but they did not become noticeably ill. This, Barron argued, suggested that it was the islet cells, rather than the pancreas as a whole, that were responsible for secreting a hormone directly into the lymph or blood streams, which has a controlling power over carbohydrate metabolism, and that these cells were able to function regardless of the status of the rest of the organ. That the islets of Langerhans might be centrally important in producing such a secretion was not a new idea by 1920. French pathologist Gustave-Édouard Laguesse had speculated that this might be the case as early as 1894. However, it is likely that Barron's article was the first time Banting had been exposed to the theory, or at least the first time he had given it any serious thought. Turning in, he had a restless night and slept poorly. His thoughts meandered. But then an idea coalesced. It occurred to me that by experimental ligation of the duct and the subsequent degeneration of a portion of the pancreas, that one might obtain the internal secretion free from the external secretion. I got up and wrote down the idea and spent most of the night thinking about it. In simple terms, Banting's theory was as follows. The pancreas was likely responsible for producing both powerful digestive enzymes, the external secretion, and a substance necessary for utilizing carbohydrate, the internal secretion. If the latter could be captured, it might have some use in reducing blood sugar. Previous attempts to isolate it had, however, been largely unsuccessful. This, he reasoned, might be because when the two came into contact, the external secretion destroyed the more delicate internal one. However, if it was true that the latter was made specifically by the islets of Langerhans, and if it was also true that their health was almost completely independent of that of the rest of the pancreas, then perhaps there was a simple solution. If the pancreatic ducts were closed, the parts of the organ that made digestive enzymes would degenerate, leaving only the islet cells behind. From there, the much sought-after internal secretion could, in theory, be harvested in relatively pure form, safe from any damage. Banting's scribbled note, written in semi-legible cursive, is quite clearly the work of a tired, stressed man in the early hours of the morning. It reads, Diabetes. Ligate pancreatic ducts of dog. Keep dogs alive till acini degenerate, leaving islets. Try to isolate the internal secretion of these to relieve glycosuria. Probably for the first time in a long while, Banting woke up full of enthusiasm. He discussed his theory with colleagues at the university, but while they were encouraging, he was told that Weston lacked either the resources or specialist expertise to play host to the kind of experiments necessary to pursue it further. He was not dissuaded. The personal stakes were too high. This could be a route to serious professional recognition. One name that did come up frequently in his discussions with colleagues was John MacLeod. MacLeod was a Scot who had worked at universities across Europe and North America, and was considered one of the foremost global authorities on the subject of carbohydrate metabolism. If anyone could say whether the idea had merit, it would be him. MacLeod, as it turned out, had taken a job at the University of Toronto only a few years prior, in 1918, and, in a stroke of luck, Banting intended to be in the city the very next week to attend a wedding. In many respects, it is quite surprising that MacLeod decided to speak with Banting at all. The two men had never previously met, and the senior professor was a well-established and highly respected academic who could easily have decided that meeting this insignificant small-town doctor was not worth his time. Nonetheless, he agreed to hear him out. In the event, the meeting went spectacularly poorly. So poorly, in fact, that Banting later remembered MacLeod's attention drifting from him to the papers on his desk, which he began to obviously read. Things had not gotten off to a good start. While he agreed with the basic premise that digestive enzymes might be responsible for destroying the internal secretion, MacLeod was not impressed. Banting was never a particularly articulate or confident speaker, and his overall knowledge of the topic was superficial. Effectively a layman, he had turned up at the office of a global authority on the subject with glaring gaps in his knowledge, only to claim that he had, in a single evening, devised one weird trick that might solve a problem with which esteemed scientists had wrestled unsuccessfully for decades. Charitably, he seemed naive. Less charitably, arrogant. Despite these poor first impressions, Banting somehow won MacLeod around, or at least left him sufficiently intrigued to take a chance. It is impossible to say what precisely the turning point was, but despite his reservations, he clearly felt that something in the theory was worth pursuing. The professor remained relatively unenthusiastic, but agreed that it was worth trying, and indicated that he would support some preliminary investigations. MacLeod, however, warned that this was no small undertaking, and that in all likelihood it would come to nothing. Did Banting really want to give up his life in London for what would probably be an exercise in futility? He returned home and mulled over the issue for several months. It was obvious that pursuing something so risky was a large gamble. In London, he had a foot in the door at Weston, and trade had finally begun to improve. But there is no indication that he found the work particularly fulfilling or that he liked the city itself. The line that in early 1921 Banting was beside himself with anticipation, common in older heroic accounts, is pure fiction. He did not even write back to MacLeod to discuss coming to Toronto until March, and, even after, considered alternative paths right up until the 26th of April, when he had decided that nothing had presented itself, closed up his practice, and made for the railway station. He did not, however, sell his house in London until months later. Clearly, he felt the situation warranted caution and thought it wise to keep his options open. The early experiments. When Banting arrived in Toronto, MacLeod introduced him to Charles Best, a young student who was to assist with the experiments. The plan seemed simple enough. The two men would operate on laboratory dogs to tie closed their pancreatic ducts. After several weeks, when the organ was sufficiently degenerated, an extract would be made from the remaining tissue. This would then be injected into another dog whose pancreas had previously been fully removed, causing the symptoms of diabetes. If the theory was correct and the extract contained the elusive internal secretion with none of the harmful digestive fluid, then, theoretically, the level of sugar in the dog's blood would fall and its condition would improve. The work began on the 17th of May. MacLeod spent several weeks ensuring that his charges understood how to perform the necessary procedures before leaving them to get on with it, departing Toronto in mid-June to spend the summer at home in Scotland. The experiments did not get off to a particularly auspicious start. While Banting's background in surgery surely helped, neither he nor Best had much experience with this kind of precise technical work. The laboratory space they were given did not help either. It was barely worth the name. The rooms were cramped, dirty, and sweltering in the summer heat, and infections following surgery were common. Banting was so worried at the rate he was getting through the university supply of laboratory dogs that he started to covertly replace them with others he found for sale, sometimes in questionable circumstances, on the streets of Toronto. 19 dead animals later, on the 8th of July, he and Best had successfully performed the ligation procedure only twice. Nevertheless, this was enough to test the theory. On the 30th of July, Banting cut out the shriveled pancreas of one dog and prepared it according to MacLeod's instructions. The process seems macabre by today's standards. The organ was chopped up and mixed with a briny preservative solution, frozen, and then ground into a paste that must have resembled a particularly unappetizing pâté. From here, it was filtered and gradually warmed. Amazingly, it seemed to work. When it was injected into the dog whose pancreas had been removed in advance, producing diabetic symptoms, the animal's blood sugar fell by over half within the space of an hour. Despite this encouraging start, however, further doses did not appear to be as effective. The next morning, Banting found it desperately sick, and it died a few hours later. Banting and Best tried again over the following days and weeks, refining their technique as they went. This time, their results seemed much more promising. Injections did often seem to reduce blood sugar. One dog was even brought back from death's door for a brief period, rising from a coma to stand up and wander around. After their last animal died on the 19th of September, they considered the results overwhelmingly positive, and Banting must have felt that his theory had been vindicated. Even the ever-cautious MacLeod, who arrived back in Toronto a few days later, was optimistic and agreed that further research should be done. Banting was, however, by this point, almost completely out of money. He had not been paid for his work over the summer, and there was simply no way that he could afford to continue. Worse, he had cut all ties with London, selling his house there in early September after becoming convinced that he was on to something big. During a meeting with MacLeod, he displayed a newfound confidence, threatening to take his research to another institution if he was not provided with a salary for the winter, someone to help care for the animals, more space to work in, and repairs to the decrepit old laboratory he and Best had been using. The exchange was fiery, and it was becoming increasingly obvious that the two men did not like one another at a personal level, but MacLeod begrudgingly agreed to his terms. On the 14th of November, Banting, Best, and MacLeod attended the Physiology Department's Journal Club to give a talk on their research. The meeting, coincidentally held on Banting's 30th birthday, was a modest affair, and an awkward one for the uncomfortable public speaker. Nevertheless, it prompted one audience member to suggest that a promising next step might be to attempt to show that a dog could be kept alive over a long period of time using the pancreatic extract. All three agreed that this was a good idea. There was, however, a problem. The extract was slow and difficult to produce. The procedure necessary to ligate the pancreatic duct was complex and still prone to failure. Even when everything went as planned, it took weeks for the organ to sufficiently degenerate, and only a small amount of usable material could be harvested from one animal. Securing a consistent enough supply of the extract to keep a dog alive for weeks, months, or longer seemed a tall order. In the end, Banting came up with a relatively simple workaround. As animals do not need to digest their food while in the womb, he speculated that fetal pancreas might contain the internal secretion, but few or no harmful digestive enzymes. Theoretically, then, effective extracts could be produced from these organs without any complex surgical work and at a significantly faster pace. When they tested the theory using fetal pancreases sourced from a local abattoir, they found that it worked just as well as the degeneration method. This solution was resourceful, but it turned out to be unnecessary. In early December, Banting and Best had begun to use an alcohol-based preservative solution in place of saline. They used this first with the fetal material and then, to see what would happen, on a non-degenerated adult dog pancreas. Bizarrely, both seemed to work perfectly well. In a later publication, Best reasoned that the use of alcohol as a preservative, made slightly acidic by the addition of hydrochloric acid, neutralized the harmful digestive enzymes. In any case, the extract could now be produced quickly and efficiently from cheap, whole, adult organs available at any common slaughterhouse. It was now possible to begin long-term testing. Banting and Best were able to keep a depancreatized dog alive from the 17th of November until the 2nd of December, before it abruptly died. Undeterred, from 6th of December, they tried again. This time the dog, affectionately known as Marjorie, responded well. Receiving daily injections, it survived across the holiday period for a total of over 2 months. Even more encouragingly, it might have lived far longer. Banting decided to have it euthanized on the 27th of January. Clearly, he felt the experiment had run its course. The first human trial. Buoyed by his success with Marjorie, in early January Banting petitioned MacLeod to arrange a human trial. MacLeod was skeptical, but he eventually relented, approaching Duncan Graham, chair of the university's medical department, a senior consultant at the Toronto General Hospital, TGH, and one of his personal friends. Graham agreed to have Banting's extract administered to one of his most seriously ill patients. There is very little recorded information about the first person with diabetes to ever receive insulin outside of the context of the TGH. This is not particularly surprising. Leonard Thompson was a charity patient, so his family cannot have been wealthy. Amongst the sea of notables that feature consistently in the early story of insulin, Leonard appears to have been a remarkably unremarkable young boy. In 1922, he lay dying. The 14-year-old had started to wet the bed and complain of tiredness in 1919, and was diagnosed with diabetes soon after. As was common at the time, he was told to adopt a starvation diet of the kind advocated by physicians like Frederick Allen. He lost weight over the following years and by late 1921 was a shadow of his former self. Emaciated, suffering from extreme thirst and barely able to summon the energy even to leave his bed. Leonard was able to secure a place at the TGH only because his family doctor had connections there and was able to call in some favors. When he was admitted on the 2nd of December, the staff did not have high expectations. He weighed barely 65 pounds, 29.5 kilograms, and was extremely ill. By January, things were looking dire. Even the most optimistic of those present doubted he was long for the world. Frank Allen was a medical student at the TGH when Thompson was brought in, and later remembered his pitiful state. He was admitted to the hospital in a serious condition, emaciated and feeble. The dietary regimen employed in the hospital failed to check his downward course. He was a pathetic figure as he lay quietly in his bed or sat still in the chair at the bedside, too weak to show interest in the activities of the large, busy ward. All of us knew that he was doomed. That Thompson had been able to secure a place at the TGH at all was fortunate for a child of his station. Yet, despite, or perhaps more cynically, precisely because of, his socio-economic situation, he was chosen to be the first to receive Banting and Best's experimental extract. In a series of events that would give the members of most 21st century ethics committees heart palpitations, on the 11th of January 1922, Leonard was injected with what one of those present later described as thick brown muck. It was not a success. While it did slightly reduce the boy's blood sugar, it did nothing for his overall condition, and he developed a painful abscess. No more of the extract was given. Banting tried to put a positive spin on things. His blood sugar had fallen after all, but there is little doubt that he was dismayed. The first human trial of the pancreatic extract had fallen far short of expectations. The experiment had clearly been premature. Animal studies were still ongoing, and while they had worked continuously to tinker with and refine the production process, Banting and Best were still unable to reliably produce anything with a standardized potency. Some batches caused a dramatic reduction in blood sugar, while others appeared to have almost no effect at all, and side effects remained troublingly unpredictable. Only a month before the trial with Thompson, however, MacLeod had, at Banting's request, enlisted the aid of James Collip. Collip was not a medical doctor but an experienced and well-respected academic biochemist in Toronto, on sabbatical from his usual post at the University of Alberta. Throughout December, his considerable technical skill allowed him to produce a far more consistently effective pancreatic extract than Banting and Best could have hoped to achieve. Collip was not at all happy when he discovered that Banting's extract had been tested on Thompson. It had been made entirely behind his back and with none of the innovative techniques that he had developed. He later described it as absolutely useless for continued administration to the human subject. Why had Banting acted so recklessly? The most likely answer is that he was simply insecure and jealously protective of a project he considered very much his own brainchild. He had always been concerned that MacLeod would attempt to steal credit for his idea. This was one of the key factors behind their strained relationship. When Collip joined the team and made vast improvements to the extract production process over a relatively short period of time, it highlighted just how underqualified both he and Best actually were. If MacLeod had chosen to marginalize them and the first human trial had been performed with an extract they had no hand in making, then they might easily have been written out of the history, remembered only as junior collaborators who worked alongside the real innovators, MacLeod and Collip. This was not an entirely unreasonable fear on Banting's part. By early 1922, he and Best had reluctantly taken more of a back seat. The priority had become producing the extract in as pure a form as possible, and this was work that neither were equipped to meaningfully contribute to. Banting had staked everything on the project, and he found the idea that he might be denied credit utterly humiliating. Everything that had been achieved, he felt, originated with his idea, scrawled on a notepad by his bed over a year prior in London. By pushing for an initial clinical test on the 11th of January with his and Best's extract, Banting placed himself into a firm position of precedence. If the experiment worked, he could celebrate. If it did not, he had still performed the first human trial of the research group's extract, and any later improvements would be read as refinements to his invention. Ironically, it is usually Collip who is forgotten in the story of insulin, in no small part thanks to Banting and Best's conscious choice to undermine his importance in later years. In reality, he did more than anyone to transform pancreatic extracts into a viable clinical treatment for diabetes. Thompson certainly owed him his life. After Banting's ill-advised trial, Collip worked alone in the university's pathology department day after day, and often long into the night, performing countless experiments in an effort to refine the active principle of the extract, the precise chemical part of it that reduced blood sugar, free from other contaminants. By the 19th of January, he thought he had succeeded. A few days later, on the 23rd, Thompson was given another injection using Collip's sterile and highly potent formula. It had immediate and dramatic effects. His blood sugar fell markedly, and his physical condition visibly improved. Against all the odds, it looked like he was going to make it. The reaction. The Toronto group excitedly produced a flurry of articles in February 1922. Throughout, they were careful to manage expectations. In the most significant, a piece for the Journal of Laboratory and Clinical Medicine, Banting and Best described their animal experiments throughout late 1921 and early 1922. While clearly enthusiastic about the potential of their results, they warned against inferring that the new extract could be used to successfully treat humans with diabetes. Their caution was well justified. Thompson's first injection on the 11th of January had not produced the immediate recovery they had hoped for, and while he was considerably improved after being given Collip's purified extract later in the month, there was still much uncertainty about its long-term effectiveness. By March, however, they were more confident. In an article for the Canadian Medical Association Journal that focused primarily on the trials being conducted on Thompson, they concluded optimistically. By using the extract, they claimed, it was possible to effectively neutralize the symptoms of diabetes. 1. Blood sugar can be markedly reduced even to normal values. 2. Glycosuria can be abolished. 3. The acetone bodies, ketones, can be made to disappear from the urine. 4. The respiratory quotient shows evidence of increased utilization of carbohydrates. 5. A definite improvement is observed in the general condition of these patients, and in addition, the patients themselves report a subjective sense of well-being and increased vigor for a period following the administration of these preparations. At the beginning of May, MacLeod traveled to Washington, D.C. to present a paper to the conference of the Association of American Physicians, AAP. This was and remains an important annual event, and numerous luminaries from across the medical profession were present, including Allen, widely considered the world's leading authority on diabetes. While the team's research had received some prior attention, mostly from the local press, this was the talk that really put a spotlight on Toronto. MacLeod's presentation was received with overwhelming enthusiasm. Elliot Joslin recalled that a standing vote of thanks was moved to express to Professor MacLeod and his co-workers appreciation of his epoch-making discovery. Even Allen was mightily impressed, remarking that insulin, as the Toronto group were now calling it, might well be one of the greatest achievements of modern medicine. The despair associated with those desperate, severe cases of diabetes that seemed universally terminal might, it seemed, yet become a thing of the past. By May, Thompson was considered well enough to return home, and he was discharged on the 15th. Allen, who had seen his condition when he was first admitted, later recalled crossing paths with the now adolescent boy as an intern years later, and being astounded at his apparent health. 3 years later, when I was an intern in the Toronto General Hospital, I saw Leonard Thompson when he came in regularly to secure his supply of insulin. He was now a sturdy young man who showed little resemblance to the emaciated dying boy who had been the subject of the most crucial clinical experiment in the field of diabetes. In all of the fanfare that followed, it is easy to forget that the first human to benefit from insulin disappeared into relative obscurity, living a quiet life as a factory worker until his death from pneumonia, only 13 years later. While Elizabeth Hughes became, much to her own discomfort, something of a poster child for insulin, Thompson is rarely even referred to by name in contemporary reporting, and we know next to nothing about his later years. Similarly, it is difficult to imagine someone like Hughes receiving that first experimental injection. That it was Thompson who was chosen was telling. What little privilege he and his family had was sufficient to have him admitted to the TGH as a charitable patient. Ironically, however, on the ward, his humble status set him aside from his fee-paying equivalents. The subtext here is clear. Thompson was an unimportant boy from a working-class background, used as a human guinea pig and then cast aside and ignored in favor of his more glamorous contemporaries when his expendable body was no longer required. In this grand story, he is portrayed as a passive object rather than a unique person in his own right. As if to hammer home the point, after his death, his pancreas was removed and kept as a trophy. placed on display at Toronto's Banting Institute. The aftermath. The move to large-scale insulin production came with some significant teething problems. At one point in early 1922, for example, Collip simply forgot how to make his purified extract. Despite his brilliance as a chemist, he was, apparently, not the most organized of characters, and had neither kept detailed notes nor told anyone else the exact process. What resulted was a desperate scramble to rediscover an effective method as vital supplies dwindled, forcing the group to ration what they had made available. Thankfully, by mid-May, they had achieved a much-needed, albeit embarrassing, second breakthrough, and production could finally begin on an industrial scale. From the outset, the Toronto group set out to ensure that insulin would be made available to as many people as possible, regardless of wealth. Despite reservations about patenting their discovery, they were concerned that someone else, smelling profit, might develop a sufficiently modified version and choose to do so independently, potentially snatching the practical manufacturing rights from under their noses. Understandably, they quickly decided to begin the process of applying for their own. MacLeod later made it clear that this was a defensive decision, reflecting in 1924 that the primary objective had been preventing any other person from taking out a similar patent which might restrict the preparation of insulin. When the patent was granted to Banting, Best and Collip in January 1923, they immediately transferred the rights to the university's Board of Governors for $1 apiece. The Connaught Antitoxin Laboratory, just outside of Toronto, had been contracted to begin production of insulin in February 1922. But this small university-affiliated institution suffered major technical issues from the outset, and even when things were operating as expected, could only make so much. By May, it was increasingly obvious that production needed to be scaled up considerably if it was going to meet demand. For some time, George Clowes, a representative of then modest Indianapolis drug manufacturer Eli Lilly and Company, had been making it very clear that his employers were extremely keen to get in on the insulin game. The firm's leadership were, correctly, convinced that the new miracle drug could be highly profitable in the long term and might establish them as major players in the pharmaceutical market. They did not, of course, say as much in discussions with Toronto. Instead, they tugged at the Canadians' heartstrings. There was simply not enough insulin to go around, and most of what was produced went to the very wealthy. Was this not unfair? Toronto's Board of Governors were hesitant, but it was true that demand for their new life-saving medication was significantly outstripping Connaught's supply capacity. They came to an agreement with Eli Lilly at the end of May. The company would have the exclusive right to produce and distribute insulin throughout most of the Americas, Canada excluded, for 1 year. In return, during this period, they would be expected to share any improvements to the production process, alongside any new patents that resulted for markets outside of the United States, where they would retain sole rights. The Americans would also send free shipments of insulin to Toronto and a small group of selected physicians and institutions for experimental purposes, and they would sell the surplus at cost once production was sufficient. Eli Lilly clearly expected to be given a more robust long-term license after the initial agreement expired, but they demanded no further exclusivity. On the surface, this seems like a very generous deal, uncharacteristic of the private sector, but Eli Lilly obviously had a long-term plan. By the terms of the deal, they would learn how to make insulin before any of their competitors, and the agreement all but guaranteed a further contract with better terms at a later date. Being able to retain single ownership of the U.S. patents for any new innovations could potentially reap great rewards. But even if they did not make any technical advances, this first year was a valuable head start. Eli Lilly could perfect their operation before anyone else had a chance to begin, while also generating name recognition for their branded version of insulin, Iletin. Even better, they could do all of this while projecting the image of an ethical company interested in more than just shrewd business. Nonetheless, potential profit was always a top priority. In a rather revealing moment in 1923, the company's president, J.K. Lilly, even pushed Clowes to make the case that Toronto should renew the exclusivity contract indefinitely. It had, he said, become proper for us to carefully consider the commercial phase, arguing that best results could be achieved by licensing but one maker in each of the principal countries of the world. This particular demand was refused, but it is clear that the deal was always considered an investment first and foremost, and one that would ensure a significant edge in the years to come. Insulin production in North America remained inconsistent until the last few months of 1922, by which time Eli Lilly had effectively ironed most of the kinks out of their manufacturing process. By the early months of the following year, they even built up a surplus, and they were able to make up for a continued shortfall in Canada, where the Connaught Laboratories' capacity still lagged, while also beginning to ship supplies further afield. Across the Atlantic and beyond, news of insulin had been met with considerable initial skepticism. The idea that a simple injection could effectively end the suffering of so many desperately ill people seemed far too good to be true, and European doctors treated the supposed miracle cure with suspicion. As time rolled on, however, it became impossible to ignore that something of great importance had been achieved in Canada, and many began to loudly demand that it be made available for their own practices. From the second half of 1922, Toronto began to license insulin production internationally, eventually extending rights to 25 countries across the globe. By early 1924, supplies were, at least in the wealthier countries that were considered important, secure. Eli Lilly continued to be the biggest manufacturer, but Connaught had managed to ramp up production sufficiently enough that Canada no longer relied on imports from the United States. Despite a slow start, European operations in Britain, Denmark, and Poland were also well underway. Those who saw insulin in action were almost universally amazed, and with good reason. Before and after photographs from the period retain a genuine sense of wonder. Their initially emaciated subjects, many of them children, are shown restored to health, seemingly miraculously, within a matter of days or weeks. Initial caution notwithstanding, by mid-1923, few could deny that this was something groundbreaking. Banting was propelled to fame almost overnight. He was made an attending physician at the TGH in August. This was a significant promotion with a salary to match, but it was probably granted more out of concern that he might jump ship and take his now considerable reputation elsewhere than because of his great skill as a clinician. It was around this period that he saw Hughes and others, most of them from a very different world to Thompson, the first successful insulin patient. By the autumn of 1923, he had become a household name and received a variety of honours. The most impressive, perhaps, came in June, when the Canadian Parliament voted to award him an annual stipend of 7,500 Canadian dollars, over 100,000 Canadian dollars in today's money, in recognition of his achievement. Within the space of 2 years, he had risen from obscurity to become one of the country's most celebrated figures. This perhaps reinforced a certain sense of self-importance. In October 1923, Banting learned that he was to be awarded the Nobel Prize for his work, the first ever to go to a Canadian. It should go without saying that this is one of the greatest marks of public recognition that any scientist or physician can hope for. The vast majority, even the most talented, will never come close to achieving it. With this in mind, Banting's reaction seems incredible. He had won the prize, but it was to be shared with MacLeod. Relations amongst the researchers had always been strained, and tension about how to divide credit had been bubbling under the surface since at least early 1922, but the Nobel announcement caused it to explode into outright hostility. Banting was incandescent with rage at the prospect of MacLeod getting half of the credit, while Best, who he felt had contributed significantly more to the project, was sidelined. He clearly felt that all of his anxieties about his work being stolen were being proven justified. Furious, he even declared that he planned to reject the award entirely. In the end, he did not, and the ceremony went ahead, but he insisted on sharing his half of the prize money with Best. Perhaps backed into a corner, MacLeod, after some deliberation, split his with Collip. For what should have been a triumphal celebration, the mood was sour, and the men split on very poor terms. MacLeod and Banting's relationship in particular was in tatters, and the younger man held a lifelong grudge. They went to their graves having never reconciled. MacLeod in his hometown of Aberdeen in 1935 after several years of ill health, and Banting, rather more dramatically, following an aeroplane crash in Newfoundland in 1941, en route to Britain during the Second World War. Evaluating Toronto. So, a century later, how should we look back on the discovery of insulin? The story is impressive, but the traditional narrative tends to miss some important details. To start, Banting was by no means the first person to create a pancreatic extract that could successfully reduce blood sugar in either laboratory animals or humans. This had actually been achieved several times since Minkowski and von Mering first drew attention to the hypothetical internal secretion in 1889. The most prominent pre-Banting extract was probably that made by Berlin's Georg Ludwig Sulzer. In 1906, Sulzer injected a comatose man, likely experiencing DKA, with a pancreatic extract he called acomatol. While he remained very ill, the man's symptoms significantly improved for a brief period of time before he relapsed and died. Sulzer managed to secure funding for further trials, but the results were mixed. Acomatol did often relieve the worst symptoms of diabetes, but it was inconsistent, and those treated frequently experienced debilitating side effects, sometimes even violent seizures. Sulzer remained optimistic, but his failure to solve this problem dissuaded the universities and pharmaceutical companies that might have supported him, and by the 1910s, he was increasingly marginalized. In 1914, the First World War broke out, and he was conscripted, putting an end to his research. In the years following the conflict, war-scarred Germany was no place for a desperate, middle-aged scientist lacking credibility, and a Jewish one at that. Mercifully, Sulzer was able to escape the Nazi regime. He emigrated to New York in 1934, where he faded into relative obscurity. To his credit, Banting never claimed precedence in developing any effective pancreatic extract. In fact, by the late 1920s, he openly acknowledged Sulzer, writing that the very first experimental injection that had been given to Thompson on the 11th of January 1922 had shown no meaningful improvement over the Germans' acomatol. Instead, he believed that his contribution was to produce something that consistently worked while producing few side effects. It was a shame that the extract used in that first test appeared to have been from a dud batch, but more often than not, it did seem to function as intended. He and Best had, after all, kept a dog with no pancreas alive for months. From Banting's perspective, all that was necessary was a little refinement, which Collip subsequently achieved. The key idea, though, had been his: to protect the internal secretion from the destructive digestive enzymes. Once again, it is important to stress that Banting was not in any way a specialist in the subject of carbohydrate metabolism. At best, he had what cursory knowledge he had picked up during his rushed medical education, and he had probably learned a little more during his brief time working at Weston. Had he dug further into the literature, however, he might have discovered that his eureka moment, ligating the ducts so the pancreas degenerated, then harvesting the internal secretion from the remaining islet cells, was not quite the unique insight that he thought it was. In fact, the University of Michigan's Lydia DeWitt had preempted him by almost a decade and a half, using the same process on cats in 1906. Her extract seemed to have some effect in test tube experiments, and she speculated that such a preparation might one day be used in treating diabetes. But she performed no studies on living creatures. Banting could never have known it, but there is also evidence that Frenchman Eugène Glay came up with the same theory even before DeWitt. In December 1922, when Toronto was making headlines around the world, Glay revealed that he had left an envelope in the care of the Society of Biology in Paris all the way back in 1905. When it was opened, it was found to contain details of turn-of-the-century experiments in which he had successfully used an extract made from degenerated pancreas to reduce the blood sugar of laboratory dogs. Glay had abandoned the research for lack of resources and, inexplicably, had never bothered to publish on the subject. In any case, why does this matter? Maybe others had previously had the idea to preserve the internal secretion of the pancreas by ligating the ducts or otherwise. Banting's achievement was not that he was the first to come up with the theory, but the first to take the idea far enough to produce insulin, an extract preparation that could reliably be used clinically to treat diabetes. Yet here is probably the greatest irony of all. While in theory a good idea, his method was completely unnecessary. It was actually the process of immediately chilling the extract that prevented the deterioration of the internal secretion. The digestive enzymes had always been mostly harmless, as their destructive power is not activated until they reach the small intestine. Banting's great contribution was, in hindsight, totally irrelevant. Quite how he failed to realize this is genuinely bizarre. As early as August 1921, before MacLeod had even returned to Toronto from Scotland, and long before Collip joined the team, he and Best had tested an extract made from whole, non-degenerated pancreas and had seen quite clearly that it worked. But they downplayed what should have been a remarkable result. Despite Best's later speculation about the implications of switching to alcohol as a preservative, Banting never seemed to reflect on the deeper implications of moving to whole organ extracts for his theory. It would probably be overly cynical to read any deliberate bad faith into this. Banting was not equipped to engage in extensive self-criticism in this area, even if he had wanted to do so. He was no expert in the theoretical principles at work and never became one. Nonetheless, the truth is that many others had previously done much of the same work as the Toronto group and had developed essentially viable pancreatic extracts, but had been kept from success by sheer misfortune. Glay, mentioned before, probably falls into this category, but his decision to remain silent about his work was a strange one. Israel Kleiner, too, could easily have been celebrated as the discoverer of insulin had it not been for circumstances entirely beyond his control. In 1919, while working at New York's Rockefeller Institute in the laboratory of Samuel James Meltzer, Kleiner published a paper that described how, in 1915, he had recorded excellent results using an extract of whole pancreas on laboratory dogs. The disruption of the First World War had delayed his work, but he had managed to replicate the results. Unlike Zutzer, he reported no serious side effects beyond an occasional mild fever, and he outlined a relatively simple manufacturing process. Kleiner clearly understood the clinical implications of his discovery, writing that the temporary effect which it produced in dogs might be duplicated in man, but he remained cautious, warning that it is doubtful whether attempts along this line should be made until further knowledge has been obtained. Unfortunately, before he was able to conduct any human tests, Meltzer retired, ironically enough following a diagnosis of diabetes. The laboratory was shuttered, and Kleiner was made redundant. While he quickly found another post at the New York Homeopathic Medical College and went on to have a successful career, he never revisited the question of pancreatic extracts. Perhaps the most devastating precursor to Banting, however, was Ernest Lyman Scott. Scott, a postgraduate student at the University of Chicago, had been inspired to investigate pancreatic extracts to honor a friend who had died of diabetes. In 1911, he submitted a thesis in which he claimed to have effectively suppressed diabetic symptoms in dogs, concluding, quite correctly, that 1. There is an internal secretion from the pancreas controlling sugar metabolism. 2. By proper methods, this secretion may be extracted and will retain its activity. Scott's experience will sound very familiar. He had the same idea as Banting to extract the internal secretion by the ligation method. In his case, he quickly gave up on this strategy because the procedure was complex, and he was no surgeon. Instead, he adopted a different approach involving alcohol and rapid cooling, once again just as Banting and Best had in late 1921. This appears to have worked well. Scott certainly would have liked to continue his work. He was probably more qualified than the Canadian, all things considered. However, his research received a lukewarm reception. Years of failure had led many experienced researchers in the field to believe that pancreatic extracts were a busted flush, and he was dismissed out of hand. The cruelest irony of all came when Scott traveled to Cleveland's Western Reserve University in 1913 to discuss potential further research with a leading authority on carbohydrate metabolism. That person, as it turned out, was John MacLeod. When they met, MacLeod was polite enough but remained unconvinced. He agreed that the internal secretion of the pancreas probably existed but did not, at that time, believe that it could be effectively isolated, and he doubted whether Scott's results were repeatable. Without institutional support, Scott dejectedly abandoned the endeavor and moved on. He was in the audience when MacLeod gave his talk to the AAP conference in 1922 and seems to have been suitably nonplussed. When he found out about the 1923 Nobel Prize, he did cordially congratulate the recipients, but one can only imagine how he must have felt. Perhaps the loudest protests came from Romania, where Bucharest's Nicolae Popescu, a deeply unpleasant man whose enthusiasm for medical research was surpassed only by his love of fascism, angrily claimed that he had successfully used a pancreatic extract on laboratory animals in 1919 and should have precedence. In his defense, he had published papers to this effect in 1921, which Banting was aware of, and in early 1922 conducted some provisional human trials, albeit with mixed results. Popescu's extract pancrene was, much like Zulza's acomatol, not reliable enough to use clinically. The Nobel Prize Committee was unmoved. That said, Banting's extract was not reliable enough to be used clinically either. His apparent stroke of genius, ligating the pancreatic ducts, waiting for the organ to degenerate and harvesting the internal secretion from what remained, was not an original idea, and, in any case, played no role in making his preparation effective. His and Best's extracts were no more consistently useful than many of those that had come before. If anything, it was Collip who was responsible for the great breakthrough that made insulin clinically viable. Is the mythology around Banting still one of Canada's national